Our first set of speakers are filmmakers Brenda Miller and Ma Rana in conversation with Jessica Jacobs, the convener of Film Geographies, who I think will start us off today by talking a little bit about using film and video to capture textile crafting in participatory settings. Brenda, would you like to say hello, please, so that we can see you?
Hello, everyone.
Thank you, Brenda. And Ma, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Morning, everyone.
Morning, Ma. Good to see you. And Jessica, would you like to say hello?
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Morning, Jessica.
Morning.
And there everybody is on the screen. Great to see you all. Thank you for being here. And I will hand over to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. That's brilliant. I'm very excited to be here today. It's been a really fantastic collaboration with Stitching Together. In terms of the films, one of the reasons why I'm a geographer at Queen Mary University of London, and I really like the similarities and differences between filmmaking and craft making. And I think there's so many ways that you can use film to document what you're doing, but also create something new. And I look at filmmaking as a way of actually producing knowledge in the same way that craft and textiles is also an alternative to text in terms of producing knowledge. I'm very lucky to have in conversation with me today Brenda and Ma, who made some fabulous films for the Stitching Together call. And I just wanted to start us off, maybe if we could ask Ma and then Brenda how they felt about their own use of using filmmaking in their research and projects with textiles. Ma, if I can begin with you.
Sure, yes. Thanks, Jessica. I guess my kind of introduction to filmmaking was very much as an amateur. And at the time I was still working as a lecturer in art and design, but I was also a carer for my mother who had dementia. And I was working on a project or proposed project with Professor Fiona Hackney, who at the time was at Wolverhampton. And I was interested in using textiles as a component of my dementia care, of looking after my mother. This came about because, sorry, I realize I might kind of be going off the track, but I wanted to find a way of capturing my mother and I crafting together. So I had really no kind of expectations of what the film might look like. So as I said, I was an amateur, well, still am an amateur filmmaker. So I just had a sort of a regular DSLR camera. So I decided to set up I guess, stitch encounters with my mother over a 6-week period, 1 hour a week. And I would film myself and my mother crafting together. And then after that, I captured all this sort of video footage. And then I kind of decided how I would edit and think about creating a film from what I kind of uncovered from looking at the film footage and also listening to the audio. So constructed a story using the audio to form the basis of the film.
Thank you. And I think that's one thing that really struck me about your film is the way that the audio and it was a sound edit and the way that it carried the imagery like that and helped to guide you. And for people just starting out with making films, that's quite often a really good way to sort of organize your imagery and sort of decide what order, because editing can be quite difficult otherwise. There's so many. And the other thing I really liked about your film was its brevity, really, because when you do collect a lot of footage like that, which is a really straightforward way of doing research, ethnographic research in particular, you can end up with hours and hours of research, and it's quite hard to actually decide what to leave out of a film, because you might have so many things that capture the same moment but in slightly different ways. So I thought that was amazing, the way that you managed to be quite meticulous in your choices. Brenda, how did you document or envisage your filmmaking when you ended up with your research project about your stitching? Sorry.
I started out making film when I went to Goldsmiths to do an MFA in art practice, or rather I ended up doing art practice. I went to do textiles. And I found that because I was based in Gloucestershire and the course was in London, that my interest suddenly required me to record things. And I ended up, my first film was for my degree show work at Goldsmiths, filming in a factory that makes green baize and tennis ball cloth that's local in Gloucestershire to me. So that's where I started. And when I finished that, I found that I was still intrigued about using film to record textile processes. And it took me quite a while to find some places to get some support, because one, I hadn't got the kit on my phone. I didn't have a particularly good camera. I was really sort of starting from absolute scratch. And in the end, I've sort of collaborated on and off with a filmmaker who's based, I think he's still he's still working at Somerset Film in Bridgewater, the engine room down there. And I got a lot of support from them when to start making film. And he actually filmed with me on the Cherry Colour Buttonhole film that we were showing in this particular sort of section. And that has been a long journey. And now I'm working and using film to explore textile making as part of my PhD research. And I've gone back to looking at darning and mending, which is something I explored many years ago with the Brunel Broderers that I exhibited with. And so that's been an interesting, and it's still an ongoing and interesting journey. And my filmmaking has kind of gone off in different directions at the moment. It's gone off into a much more experimental form.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask again. If anyone's got any questions, put them in the chat. If anybody else wants to ask some questions, but one question I wanted to ask you, Mars, how do you feel that if you set out originally to document some of your work and then you actually ended up making a film, what do you think the differences were between those kind of original impetus to document and record and actually turning it into something different? Do you have any reflections to give us about that?
It was quite sort of an organic process, and I think I was sort of learning as I was going along. And what was kind of the key for me at the beginning of every sort of film session and at the end of it, I kept a reflective diary. So before I started filming, I kind of wrote down my expectations, but also my fears. And at the end of a film session, I kind of wrote down what was kind of expected, things that were unexpected, disruptions, and how I felt it went, so I could kind of move on to onto the next session. But I guess for me, it was almost about just kind of recording footage and just kind of being in the moment as much as you can do when you're kind of crafting, and just allowing the footage to kind of reveal, reveal what's there. And often that thing about kind of filmmaking can often sort of foreground things that you don't realize were happening at the time. And I think that was really useful for me. And even showing footage to like Fiona, and she would point out things that I had perhaps taken for granted. So it's very much about, filming was about kind of looking, but it was also about watching and also sharing footage with other people and listening to them and hearing what they saw. So yeah, there's very much like a reflective process in there.
Yeah, and I really like what you're saying about time and space, really, because it's actually renegotiating our relationship with time, and that we can look back in some way, and then with space, and that when we're busy with our lives, we only tend to focus on one or two things, and everything else is out of focus. like because that's what our eyes do. But when you actually play a film back or play back the video, you can see other things. So filmmaking really does allow us to reconfigure sort of our temporal spatial relationship with our environment in that way. That's brilliant. Brenda, how about you? And also there's a couple of other questions. Somebody was in the Padlet was asking what actually is cherry color, and maybe also something about if you felt that there was any challenges. I know that it's quite daunting to set out to make a film. Have you got any reflections on that?
Well, cherry color is it's an open question. I think it's something that in the actual event, I took a selection of different colors, and people were able to choose what they felt was cherry color, represented cherry color. So that was that. But it's interesting, I work in a live limited situation, and I think a lot of mine are very limited access to a factory or an event. They're very short, and that poses an awful lot of other restrictions on the outcome. But it also, what's always, like Ma was saying, it's the unexpected that you find in the footage, which is the joy of actually making the film. You rediscover things that you haven't actually been aware of when you're actually involved in the situation, and it's often the unexpected that actually is the most important part of the filmmaking. And it's interesting to see how those sort of things develop. But I've actually taken forward this whole idea of working with very limited access and limited space and limited time has become much more a feature of the way I work. Because more recently I've been working on my own. I haven't been able to work with a camera person.
Yeah, I was thinking your comment about unexpected, I think it's also the unintentional, so that we can go beyond what we actually think we want to do, and there can be other things, and it creates the possibility for that to happen. There's a question here from Rebecca Moore, which we were discussing yesterday, was did you find any similarities in creating, editing and video and with textiles? And we were just discussing this yesterday, weren't we?
Yes, I mean, I find that, my research means that there are a lot of similarities, and there are a lot of historical similarities in that women were engaged in editing film because of their fine sort of textile skills that would easily transfer to the neat cutting and precise work. So that's one of the things, but it's patchwork, I think, for me. Is when you're working on a timeline and quite a complex editing sort of process, it ends up becoming its own visual patchwork of pieces. And that's something that I've also started exploring in textile making, taking it through to back into the sort of practical, into the actual object rather than being on the digital.
There's also something about you saying about women and editing and women and making, about being in the background and sort of not being visible and more anonymous. They're not the sort of stars of the filmmaking world. They're sort of in the back room, literally in a dark room, editing away. Ma, how about you? So our last question.
Yeah, actually, before I started filming, I'd written an article by Danny Boyle, and he'd written about filmmaking being a slow process, which I hadn't kind of assumed it was, because when you see camera crews, it all look very kind of busy and sort of hectic. But I kind of took that on board, and actually, when I was holding, there were some times when I had a camera on a tripod, but when I was holding the camera, I used it as a kind of an extension of my body, that I was kind of looking through it. So it became a very embodied kind of process of filmmaking. And I just kind of was very aware that I was just not moving the camera. I was kind of using my body as well, which I think when you're working with textiles, that's very much part of that process. It's a very slow, embodied process.
Thank you, Brenda. I think that's us now, isn't it, Emma? So we're going to hand over back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Fascinating insight into using film to document textile making practices. I'm sure there's more, I feel we've just scratched the surface there, and we will return to that, no doubt. But I would now like to move on and introduce to you our two next speakers, Pina Santoro. Pina, would you like to say hello? You're on mute.
Hello.
Great to see you, Pina. Thank you. And Rose Sinclair. Rose, would you like to say hello?
Hello.
Hi, Rose. Great to have you with us too. And so everybody, here we have Rose and Pina, who are going to continue the conversation in a different direction now, to explore in conversation with each other, doing, making, sharing, collecting, documenting, textile making experiences amongst immigrant communities and the value that that holds. So I will step away and leave you two to share your conversation with us. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. Hello, Rose.
Hi, Pina.
Hi. Okay, so I'm going to just give a very quick introduction to myself and my practice before we start our talk together. Rose and I do have some overlaps in our research, so I'm really pleased to be in conversation with Rose today. Okay, so very briefly, I'm Pina, and I am a researcher from the Cambridge School of Art, which is part of Anglia Ruskin University. And my research is very much about second generation immigrant folk art, especially in my Sicilian Italian community, and how I use that as a form of communication. So I feel like I really need to mention here that I am founder of the ICAP project, and the reason I need to communicate that is because it's the first Italian community arts project in Peterborough that allows the Italian community to have any kind of presence, which is great. So this is how it all started for me with the ICAP, and I have probably been led by that community and inspired by that community in my family more than anything else. So I'm going to start with a very okay. No, I don't want that. Okay, no. I was going to bring up the presentation very quickly.
While Pina's getting the presentation ready, I'll just introduce myself and just say,
yes, thank you, Rose.
I am Rose Sinclair, and my research and my life work at the moment has been about Black women and their crafting practices, and I've mainly focused on a specific group called the Dorcas Club, emulated from the Dorcas societies of the late 17th, 18th century, but I've specifically focused on Black women who migrated here post 1948, and my interest is in their textiles that these women created in their front rooms. And so I'm really interested in how those textiles became made in communities, became made in society, and how they become documented. And one of the things that became very important for me was that I just didn't see them in any textbooks. They weren't there. I'm teaching about textiles, teaching about where I've come from, but I don't see myself represented. And I think in our conversations together, myself and Pina, I think that's one of the highlights, that we both recognise that we don't see ourselves. We teach this amazing material product, and yet we don't see ourselves in any of the textbooks. And I think we're now live, Pina. So
absolutely.
Back to you.
Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Great, thumbs up, that's great. Okay, so Rose and I came up with a series of questions. Hopefully we will have time to whiz through them all very quickly. If not, we will obviously continue on Padlet, so that's great. So I'm going to just show you a slide. I had to choose one slide that I could kind of focus on to just lead me through these questions. And we decided, Rose and I, to speak about community and our method of collecting first. Now, this particular method of collecting started in lockdown, and I usually, I'm kind of very much social practice and engaging with people and the community and speaking about the people through my materials. So in lockdown, I did kind of find that quite difficult to continue my practice. So I kind of thought to myself, right, you know, I've got to come up with something to do, because obviously it's a very solitary time. So during the COVID pandemic, my concerns and research stretched outside my usual ones. So those usual ones being of just Sicilian and Italian culture. And I also deal with identity, tradition, ritual, placement and displacement. So I thought, okay, I'm going to come up with a new contemporary art project, and but somehow I needed to still include those people. And it just came about that I was, you know, as usual, having a cup of tea and thinking. I do most of my thinking over a cup of tea. And I started to think about the relationships that I have with people. Yes, I can't go out and socially engage and run these community workshops because, you know, it wasn't, we were restricted at the time. And so it really started as a very, very close to home project. And I thought, you know, I'm going to do something with this tea bag that I've just made from my, used for my tea. And I decided to just start to play around and experiment. And then I gave them out to the children. I then gave them out to my partner. And it kind of just organically progressed into something that I thought, well, why not try? I can still communicate. And that's my way of then engaging with people. And so I decided to go beyond my usual research methods and just text a few people and say, you know, look, I'm having a go at this. What do you think at the time? And I started to ask them whether they wanted to participate and just give me a few words, because obviously the size of the, I call it a canvas, even though it's not a canvas, but, you know, it's a work surface and is very small. And much to my surprise, and a bit like what Brenda was talking about in just before us, the unexpected and the unintentional, that definitely started to come through. Not only was I able to communicate with people from my community, so my family, my friends, but also I was finding that people that I wasn't expected to be interested were all of a sudden interested. They wanted to be part of something. They wanted a voice and they wanted an outlet. And even though they weren't actually doing the making at the time, they very much wanted to be involved, and they were sending me 3 words over text or on social media message and things like that. And much to my surprise, it's grown into a really wonderful project with probably over 100 participants. So it's grown into something much bigger than I feel I would have been able to possibly do in a workshop or something like that. I've reached a much wider community. So the immigrant community aspect of it is still coming through. But I've been able to reach even further people like, that just wouldn't be involved in craft or contemporary art projects. So that has been a really fantastic, unexpected element of this project. And I don't know whether you can focus in, but very delicate work. And I just started myself. I thought I'd show you some of my very early ones here. So this tablecloth is an Easter tablecloth, and I've literally recorded almost like a diary of what was going on in that. This was probably a month's work. I'd probably do one a day, focusing on something particularly important to me at the time. So, Rose, do you want to talk about your method of collecting?
Yeah, so we'd have to put it onto the next slide. So my method of collecting has been both from objects that have been given to me, as well as objects that I have collected. So the one that you can see on the left hand side, which says "God bless you both," was given to me 30 years ago by my grandmother. It's an embroidered. It was given to me on my wedding day, and it's embroidered. And she made this the year that I told her I was getting married in 1989. She made this at her Dorcas Club and brought it on the airplane when she travelled from Jamaica. And that sat in my study for so long, but I kept looking. That's the piece that gave me the impetus to start my research. But all the other pieces that you see, all the other 4 pieces that you see there, have either been given to me, or the green crochet, the green kind of crochet that usually would stand up really stiff and starched. That's the piece that my mum was crocheting when she was traveling did the 2-week travel on the ship from Jamaica in 1960 to get here. The basket, for instance, came from a women's collective in Kingston, Jamaica, where they actually grow the grass up in the hills in Kingston. They then weave it, and the baskets are then stitched down at the local church in Kingston before being sold, and the money is then used to help send kids to school. And then the kind of the bulky crochet, the purple one that you can see, that emerged out of a Dorcas Club where in the 1970s, where they used to cut up strips of nylon fabric, and then crochet them, and these would go on their tabletops and radiograms. And it kind of tells me that there was something happening within that kind of the aesthetic of the Black community, that there was this movement from this really fine crochet, which needed starching and ironing, to this notion of using nylon and nylon to actually make something that you could put in the wash, stick on the line. It would dry in an hour. You could put it back on your tabletop, and you wouldn't have to starch it. And it's kind of this whole thing that of all these things, the message that kept coming back to me from the people in the community was, we don't think these things had any value. So they would end up in the bin, they would end up being thrown away, they would end up being just discarded because they didn't have any value. And I think both myself and Pina, we both recognise that when we collect, we are collecting not just because we love textiles, but because we're trying to retain this notion of history, and we're trying to actually find out the stories behind the pieces. Because when you have the stories, you have this other thing that then becomes this material culture that gets embedded and gets then put alongside all the other material cultures that exist, and tells us the stories of us, if you like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we both felt that if these stories are missing, then we don't have these complete stories of communities that are now transient, that are now passing, that are now disappearing.
Yeah.
And within those stories become these other communities that just get missed.
Yeah. Yeah, we're both collecting and documenting our communities. Absolutely. Yeah.
And we both feel that it's important to document these as part of a British history. They are not, I think one of the things that we found was that the language that's being used, about the othering language that's being used on both our, when our communities are discussed, it's this othering of those communities, or how do you connect with those communities? And we keep saying, well, actually, they're not those communities. They're not aliens. They're not from other planets. They are in the community already. And what we're doing is that we're just highlighting that what we call the quotidian, or the everyday objects that they have, are an important part of a British textile history. And if we don't write about them, if we don't collect them, if we don't write about them, if they're not in our local museums or local spaces, then those archival stories of practice and craft get lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can speak for many people that I've worked with on my projects, my research projects, that, you know, as an immigrant, you can feel very invisible. And so this is a lovely visible reminder of the community in the UK at this time, definitely. So I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. So making practice. I'll just quickly talk about my making practice. I also am very inspired by objects like Rose, cultural objects. This one in particular is an Easter tablecloth that my mother and my grandmother, one of them, brought over from Sicily when they emigrated. And, you know, things like this were often brought out at Easter and used to kind of pretty up the table and, you know, celebrate spring and all the lovely things that come with that. And so this particular tablecloth I worked on the first Easter during lockdown. And so it was my kind of basis for what I realized what I was doing was to make and kind of document the diaries, my daily life as a diary on these small surfaces. And so you can probably see here it says, I miss Luca. Now, Luca is my son. And here I miss Sicily, which is my daughter. And it was because, you know, we couldn't have that celebration, that traditional celebration where we would, you know, enjoy being together and just having that very special Easter day. In the Italian culture, Easter is probably just as big, if not more important than Christmas. And that goes back to, I suppose, being connected with the church and what that church community gives you, that sense of belonging. And so, you know, it was thinking about my faith and our time together with family, people that are no longer here. You know, we would think about those. And so that's how my practice kind of comes together. It was very much a daily diary almost. So that's my my making. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about your making, Rose.
Pina.
Before we go on to beyond the making, we're kind of.
Pina, can I jump in actually,
yes,
and ask if we can continue? I mean, this is fascinating. I think we could sit and listen to you for hours. It's so interesting what you both have to say. And I'm thinking there's something there as well to draw out about the materials in participatory making as well as the process. But
Definitely.
can I ask you to perhaps move the conversation to the Padlet at this point so we can move on?
Okay.
Could
So,
you?
yeah, I think we have kind of covered most of those things. It's just beyond the making, I think, that we could probably, continue.
That would be wonderful. And there's some fantastic comments in the chat, so maybe the discussion can continue there as well. Could you sharing your screen, please? Pina?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Pina.
You're welcome.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And now I'm going to hand over to Amy. Amy, would you like to just give a shout? There you are. Amy,
Here I am.
I'll hand over to you.
Yes, so thank you so much to Pina and Rose for that really interesting conversation. So yeah, moving on to the next bit. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak to Sally Stone and Catherine Townsend. So Sally, could you just give us a hello so we can see who you are? Okay, hopefully you'll magically appear on the screen for everyone in a moment. And Catherine, could you say hello?
Hello. Am I appearing?
We'll do in a moment.
It's hard to tell, isn't it?
Okay, Kath there, and there's Sally. Okay, we're all here. We've made it. We've managed the Zoom buttons. Okay, so yeah, so Sally created a presentation for us that's available on the website about the Yarnstorming project that she's led since 2013 in Roundtree Park in York. And Catherine, who is also one of my close colleagues, is one of the makers of one of the films that were shared for this session called Emotional Fit, which documents a research project of the same name, which involved older women exploring their experiences and desires for fashion, I suppose we might say. So we've got a couple of themes that we can kind of talk about and see how we go. So if we could start with Sally. Sally, in your presentation, I got a really strong sense that the projects are really successful in offering loads of different ways for people to get involved. I could see that it wasn't a thing where everybody all had to turn up in the same place at the same time and knit together to take part. Could you just tell us a bit more about that? So kind of the diversity of ways that people were able to get involved.
Yes, well, probably the first thing that we try and do when we've got a project on the go is spread the word, because if no one knows about it, they can't take part. So all the project information and patterns for stitch or knitting up on my website and social media, and locally we produce printed information. So there are posters on local notice boards and flyers that you can pick up. So we try and reach out so that people know that the project is taking place. Usually we'd have between 2 and 4 workshops that people can come along to, and we try and spread them out. So there'll be something at the weekend, in the evening, in the daytime, to try and fit in with people's lifestyles, so they might be able to come to one of them. And then when they come along, the workshops are free, all the materials are provided, and before COVID times, you could just rock up at the last minute and turn up, and we'd just take however many people appeared, whether it was loads or not so many. But we can't do that this year. You have to book onto the workshops. They're still free and all materials are still provided, but you have to book on because we have to regulate the numbers. But clearly, because we only have a limited number of workshops, that's not going to be something that everyone can, that's not going to fit into everyone's schedule. So you can use the patterns that are online and work at home. you don't have to use our patterns at all. We have a theme for the project, so you can do anything on that theme. Sometimes things that, you might think, well, I mean, this year's project are butterflies and bees, and you might think, well, bees are yellow and black, but if you want to do a fantasy bee in purple and pink, that's absolutely fine. So you can join in at home however you want to with your own patterns or ours. But we also have a number of groups that join in that use our project as a focus for the work that they might want to do. So they might use their regular meetups to make things for our project. So we have a group called So Chatty in York that have joined in so far in all our projects. And they, as the name suggests, they do stitching, but they usually make up their own designs. They don't use ours, and then we get some fantastic stuff that comes from them that they've designed and created. And another group that have joined in are the Fairfax Court Yarnstormers, and they are from a retirement complex. And because a number of those the participants are quite elderly, I usually go and see them in person because they're not online and can't access the online resources, and they can't get out to the workshops. So I go and see them and take them some patterns and tell them about the project, and then they join in their regular groups. So you can join in as a formal group, or you can make up your own group of family and friends and take part at home when it's convenient or wherever it's convenient, using our patterns or not. But there are all those ways that you can take part, and you don't have to be local to take part either. Anyone who can access the information about the project can take part from wherever they are. In fact, if anyone today wants to take part, that would be great. But I suppose there's also the non-making way of joining in as well, which perhaps relates in some way, although maybe less direct, to some of Catherine's participants, in that you can also join in by sponsoring the project or donating materials, by collaborating. When we did our Brilliant Birds yarn storm, Sue Stratford very kindly let us use 2 of her bird patterns, which was great. So you might collaborate in that way. We also have collaborators in the people that give us the permission to use the spaces. Yeah. So they're collaborating with us too. And then
sorry, I'm cutting you off a little bit so we can bring Catherine in, but I love the sense of that kind of inclusivity and bringing people together in so many different ways. And you've touched on the fact that Catherine, the project that Catherine's film is about, has a different kind of stitching together. And I often use this project as an example of the broad scope of the Stitching Together network, that it's not only about people who are physically knitting or sewing together, but it's about kind of collaboration through textiles, I suppose. So yeah, Catherine, could you just say something about kind of what the experiences of the participants were in that project? Kind of what were they doing as they went through the project?
Well, they actually approached Nottingham Trent University, which some people may know this, to say, we've heard a lot about fashion for older women in the press. There's a lot of focus on it, but what's higher education doing about it? And actually it turned into a pilot research project that sort of lasted between 2015 and 2017. But yes, they didn't, although we didn't literally stitch together, the making was very much informed by the kind of the experiences and the desires of the participants to be involved in fashion again. And so we had co-design workshops and sort of exploratory workshops at the beginning, where we did show and tell. So the participants were asked to bring a favourite garment. So as well as introducing themselves, they were introducing their clothing and their kind of the things that worked for them. And then by default, the things that didn't work for them that were on offer. We also interviewed some of the participants in depth and sort of garnered sort of clothing and textile narratives, and these stories and also mood boards were created for them to sort of give us maps of what they would like and what they did like that perhaps they couldn't access. And so basically we used this sort of their collective memory and their sort of desires, future sort of desires for fashion, to make some designs, some printed textiles that were sort of created through clues. Like some of the participants, a lot of them were baby boomers, so they made references to things like Bieber and Mary Quant, stripes, browns, purples, and so we got this kind of really rich conversation and set of clues, and then we designed a set of kind of textile prototypes and geometric garment patterns that would accommodate a real variety of shapes and sizes. We were trying to move away from the sort of the standardized sizing of garments that were available, and the sort of richness of what was it that defined a sort of a garment that you would keep, and something that was emotionally durable. So it was very experimental, really, but it was. Then we kind of had iterative workshops where the groups would come back in and they would review things we'd made, try them on. Trying on was such an amazing kind of rich experience, because then what you got were you really got that tactile and sensory engagement with textiles that told us more than in a way what could be explained. And that we can know more than we can tell really came through in those kind of interactions. So we were metaphorically stitching together, if you like. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of sort of playing together with and about things and textiles, I think, really comes through in the film. I love all of the kind of it's the trying on, and you can sort of, as you say, you can really see in in people's bodies kind of how they feel when those textiles make it onto their bodies. It's so kind of revealing.
I think that became the most valuable part. I have to be honest, that became the most valuable part of the project. What happened in those kind of diagnostic exchanges, more than the sort of what we made.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's so interesting. So I'm going to stop us in a minute or two to try and be a good facilitator and not have to tell myself off for running late. But I just wanted to very briefly ask you both about the question of kind of either intergenerational contact in the case of Sally's projects. From your presentation, we could see there was, all age groups taking part together. And Catherine, yours being really focused on a particular generation. So Sally, if I could put you on the spot for a sort of 1 minute answer on, could you just say something about this kind of intergenerational connections that happen in your projects?
Well, I think what it does is it provides an opportunity for the generations to get together and to in some cases make memories, to share their experiences, to consolidate their feelings of connectedness, and to provide something to talk about. And whether that's because they've done the making together, which quite a lot do, and you can do it at various levels of skills and experience. and there's all the opportunities for sharing ideas and design and passing on skills, which is great. But one of the things that the participants really said was they loved going to the display and pointing out theirs and showing their children or their grandchildren, or the children saying which theirs was, and then sort of looking at them, and there's such a rich opportunity for sharing either the making or the viewing, or and developing those memories, and do you remember when we did such and such, and I think it really helps with feeling connected.
Wonderful. And Kath, sorry, I'll put you on the spot for just
That's all right, I can be brief. I think the learning, I think the participants, they felt overlooked by the industry. So this working through the materials of fashion and textiles, I think it helped them reconnect, and it helped, they had a lot of wisdom, they're all of experiential knowledge of fashion and textiles that they feel could really contribute to, the industry, dialogues about clothing for longevity and durability. They know about this. They learned to sew their own clothes, and then they really influenced what happened on the high street. And now, they feel excluded from it, but actually there's a real body of knowledge there in the consumer, if you like, that's being ignored. And I think it's something that needs to be tapped into, particularly in relation to sustainability, So I think I went to a talk last week by Tim Ingalls. He talked about children and the older generation being excluded from society, and actually their curiosity and wisdom is what we need to really connect again with sort of life and what it feels, the feelings and the rhythms of life. So, I think overlooked communities, there are many of them, as we're discussing, and actually it's about all communities coming together, to move forward and have a rich, a rich sort of engagement with life.
Lovely. That's a really lovely point to end on. So thank you so much, Catherine and Sally.